The gunshot echoed through the moonlit streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, as Abigail Harlow sprinted down the muddy alleyway, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The year was 1876, and she had just witnessed something no woman should ever see: the cold-blooded murder of the town's most respected banker by none other than Sheriff Wilkes himself. Rain soaked through Abigail's cotton dress as she stumbled toward the edge of town, knowing full well that to remain in Silver Creek meant certain death. At 23, she had already endured more than her fair share of hardships, but this night threatened to be her last. Her lungs burned as she pushed forward, the sounds of angry voices and pounding boots growing louder behind her. Find her. She cannot have gone far. Sheriff Wilkes's gruff command carried through the night air. Abigail's foot caught on a protruding root, sending her tumbling down the embankment that bordered the town's western edge. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but terror drove her onward. Through blurred vision, she spotted a small light flickering in the distance: a cabin, or perhaps a campfire. With no other options, she limped toward it, praying whoever awaited would show mercy to a woman in desperate need. The light belonged to a modest campfire, around which sat a solitary figure: a man with broad shoulders and a cowboy hat pulled low over his face. He looked up sharply at the sound of her approach, his hand instantly moving to the revolver at his hip. "Please," Abigail gasped, collapsing at the edge of the firelight. "They're going to kill me." The man was on his feet in an instant, his face now visible in the dancing flames. Strong-jawed and weather-beaten, with piercing blue eyes that assessed her in one swift glance. "Who's after you, miss?" His voice was deep but gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing figure. "Sheriff Wilkes and his men," she managed between ragged breaths. I saw them murder Mr. Davidson, the banker." The man's expression hardened. Without hesitation, he extinguished the fire with a swift kick of dirt, plunging them into darkness. "I'm Colton Kane," he said, helping her to her feet. "And you've just walked into a whole heap of trouble, Miss Abigail Harlow." "Well, Miss Harlow, we need to move. Now." Colton led her to where his horse stood tethered to a nearby tree, a magnificent chestnut stallion that nickered softly as they approached. With surprising gentleness, he lifted Abigail onto the saddle before mounting behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then they were off, thundering across the open plain under the cover of night. Abigail could barely process what was happening. The warmth of the stranger at her back was the only comfort in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. She had no reason to trust this cowboy, yet something in his steady manner gave her hope. They rode for what seemed like hours, the landscape gradually shifting from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. Dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when Colton finally slowed their pace. "There's a place up ahead," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "An old mining cabin. We can rest there while I figure out what to do with you." "Why are you helping me?" Abigail asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. Colton was silent for a long moment before answering. "Let's just say I've got no love for Sheriff Wilkes myself." The cabin was little more than a one-room shack nestled against a rocky outcropping, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Colton dismounted with fluid grace and helped Abigail down, steadying her when she winced at the pain in her ankle. "It's not much," he said, leading her inside, "but it'll keep us hidden for now." The interior was sparse: a small wood stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Dust covered every surface, but it was dry and, more importantly, safe. Colton moved with practiced efficiency, starting a small fire in the stove and retrieving supplies from his saddlebags. He handed Abigail a strip of dried beef and a canteen of water. "Eat something," he instructed. "Then you can tell me exactly what you saw." As warmth gradually returned to her body, Abigail recounted the events that had led her to this moment. She had been working late at the millinery shop where she was employed, finishing a hat for the mayor's wife, when she heard voices outside the back window. "I saw Sheriff Wilkes and 2 of his deputies cornering Mr. Davidson in the alley," she explained, her hands trembling at the memory. "Davidson was saying something about ledgers and proof. Then Wilkes. He just shot him, right there in the street. They saw me watching from the window and I ran." Colton's expression remained carefully neutral, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Davidson was gathering evidence," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I should have known they'd catch up to him." "You knew him?" Abigail asked, surprise momentarily overriding her fear. "Not personally," Colton replied, his eyes meeting hers. "But I've been tracking Wilkes and his operations for months now. The man's been extorting businesses, running protection rackets, even diverting shipments of gold from the mines. Davidson must have found proof in the bank's records." "Then you're not just a cowboy," a ghost of a smile crossed Colton's face. "I work for the territorial marshal's office, or I did. I'm somewhat of a free agent these days." He moved to check her injured ankle, his touch clinical but gentle. "It's not broken, just sprained. You're lucky." "Lucky?" Abigail let out a bitter laugh. "I've lost my job, my home, and now I'm being hunted by the most powerful man in the county." "You're alive," Colton countered, "and you're the witness I've been waiting for." The following days established a cautious routine. Colton left each morning before dawn to scout the area and gather supplies from a small trading post several miles away. Abigail remained in the cabin, her ankle slowly healing, her mind constantly replaying the horror she had witnessed. On the 3rd day, Colton returned with a newspaper from Silver Creek. The headline sent a chill through Abigail's body. "Local woman wanted for murder of respected banker." "They're saying I killed him," she whispered, her fingers tracing the printed words as if they might rearrange themselves into the truth. "It's a smart play," Colton admitted, setting down a sack of provisions. "Wilkes controls the paper, and now he's turned the whole town against you. Makes his job easier." "What do we do?" Colton pulled up a chair across from her, his face serious. "Davidson kept records, that's what they were arguing about that night. If we can find those records, we have a chance of exposing Wilkes." "And how do we do that when I can't show my face in town without getting shot?" "I've got a few ideas," he said, the hint of a plan forming in his eyes. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Colton taught Abigail how to handle his spare revolver. Her hands shook at first, the weight of the weapon foreign and frightening. "I can't," she protested, trying to hand it back. "You need to be able to defend yourself if I'm not here," he insisted gently. "I hope you never have to use it, but hope doesn't keep people alive out here." Under his patient instruction, Abigail gradually became more comfortable with the gun. The lessons continued each evening, expanding to include basic survival skills: how to start a fire, how to read tracks, how to move silently through the forest. During these lessons, Abigail began to see beyond Colton's stoic exterior. He spoke little of himself, but occasional comments revealed glimpses of his past growing up on a ranch in Texas, losing his parents to a fever when he was 16, working as a scout for the cavalry before joining the marshal's service. One night, after a particularly grueling lesson in tracking, they sat outside the cabin watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. "You're a good teacher," Abigail said, breaking the companionable silence. Colton's mouth quirked into a half-smile. You're a quick learner. Most city folk don't take to these skills so easily. I'm hardly city folk. Silver Creek is barely more than a wide spot in the road. Where were you before Silver Creek? Abigail hesitated, memories of her past rarely shared rising to the surface. Denver, originally, then a series of small towns after my parents died. I've been on my own since I was 18. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, she admitted. But I managed. What about you? You never mentioned family. Colton's eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon. Not much to tell. Parents gone, no siblings. The Marshal Service became my family in a way. Until you became a free agent, she quoted his earlier words. What happened? His jaw tightened. I was investigating corruption in law enforcement across the territory. Wilkes was just one name on a long list. When I got too close, suddenly, I was the one being investigated, false charges, manufactured evidence. My superior believed in me but suggested I disappear for a while, continue the work unofficially. So you're in hiding, just like me. The difference is, I chose this fight. Abigail's hand found his in the darkness, a gesture of solidarity that surprised them both. Maybe I'm choosing it now, too. The touch lingered longer than necessary, and when their eyes met, something shifted between them, a recognition of connection that transcended their circumstances. Colton cleared his throat and gently withdrew his hand. We should get some rest. Tomorrow we start planning our next move. As the days turned into weeks, the small cabin began to feel less like a hideout and more like a home. They developed an easy rhythm together, Colton hunting and gathering information, Abigail keeping the cabin in order and practicing her newfound skills. With each passing day, Abigail found herself watching Colton more closely, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, a rare but treasured sight. The careful precision with which he cleaned his weapons, the gentle way he tended to his horse. She told herself it was natural to feel drawn to the man who had saved her life, but deep down, she knew it was becoming something more. For his part, Colton maintained a careful distance, though Abigail occasionally caught him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. Whether he was protecting her or himself, she couldn't be sure. 1 month after her arrival at the cabin, Colton returned from a scouting trip with news. Davidson had a sister in Aurora, he announced, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. According to my source at the trading post, she arrived in Silver Creek last week to collect his belongings. Abigail looked up from the rabbit stew she was preparing. Do you think she has his records? If not, she might know where to find them. Either way, I need to make contact. You mean we need to make contact? Abigail corrected. Colton shook his head firmly. Too dangerous. Wilkes has men watching her, I'm certain of it. And they're looking for a woman alone, not a couple traveling together, Abigail argued. Besides, she might be more willing to trust a woman than a man she's never met. Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Colton sighed. We'll need a disguise for you at least, and we stick to the plan in and out of Aurora before anyone realizes we were there. The journey to Aurora took 2 days, during which they camped under the stars, their conversation flowing more freely away from the confines of the cabin. Abigail wore men's clothing borrowed from Colton, her hair tucked beneath a worn cowboy hat, and dark powder smudged along her jaw to suggest the shadow of a beard from a distance. How do I look? She asked, striking a pose that mimicked Colton's usual stance. He laughed a real, full-bodied laugh that Abigail had never heard from him before. Like a boy playing dress-up, but it might just work, as long as nobody looks too close. Aurora was larger than Silver Creek, a growing town fueled by both mining and the newly established railroad connection. They arrived at dusk, when shadows made Abigail's disguise more convincing and secured a room at a modest boarding house near the edge of town. The proprietress, a plump woman named Mrs. Finley, barely glanced at them as she handed over the key. Room at the top of the stairs. Breakfast at 7. No drinking, no fighting, no women. Colton nodded solemnly. Yes, madam. Just me and my younger brother passing through. Once inside the small room with its single bed and washstand, the awkwardness of their situation became apparent. Abigail removed her hat, allowing her long auburn hair to cascade down her back. "I'll sleep on the floor," Colton said immediately. "Don't be ridiculous. The bed is plenty big enough for both of us." The words came out before Abigail could consider their implications. Colton's expression was unreadable as he busied himself with their supplies. "We should find Davidson's sister tomorrow. Her name is Eleanor Jenkins. She's staying with the local minister and his wife." Abigail recognized his deflection but didn't press the issue. "What's our approach?" "I think it's best if you make initial contact, woman to woman. I'll watch from a distance to make sure you're safe." The next morning, Abigail dressed in her own clothes for the first time in weeks, a simple blue dress that Colton had purchased from a general store on their journey. Her hair neatly braided and pinned, she looked like any respectable young woman rather than a fugitive accused of murder. They located the minister's house easily enough, a white clapboard structure adjacent to the small church at the center of town. While Colton positioned himself across the street, appearing to browse goods at the general store, Abigail approached the front door with her heart in her throat. The woman who answered her knock was in her 40s, with the same kind eyes and strong chin that Abigail remembered from Mr. Davidson. "Mrs. Jenkins, my name is Abigail Harlow. I need to speak with you about your brother." Eleanor Jenkins's face immediately hardened. "The authorities in Silver Creek are looking for you, Miss Harlow. They say you killed my brother." "I didn't kill him," Abigail said urgently. "I saw who did. May I please come in? It's not safe for me to be seen." Something in Abigail's desperate sincerity must have convinced Eleanor, for after a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside. Inside, seated at the kitchen table with tea Eleanor insisted on serving, Abigail recounted everything she had witnessed that night in Silver Creek. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands clasped tightly around her teacup. "I believed there was something wrong about the official story," Eleanor finally said when Abigail finished. "My brother wrote to me several times in the months before his death, saying he was gathering evidence of serious wrongdoing, but he never specified what. Did he leave anything behind? Papers, ledgers, anything that might help us prove what Sheriff Wilkes has been doing?" Eleanor hesitated, then rose from her chair. "Come with me." She led Abigail to a small guest room where a trunk sat at the foot of the bed. "These are his personal effects. I haven't had the heart to go through them thoroughly." Together, they began to sort through the contents: clothing, books, personal correspondence. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilskin and bound with twine, they discovered a leather-bound ledger and a stack of documents. "This is it," Abigail breathed, carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was detailed documentation of Sheriff Wilkes's criminal enterprise protection payments from businesses, records of stolen shipments, even evidence of 2 murders disguised as accidents. "My brother died for this," Eleanor said softly, tears filling her eyes as she scanned the pages. "And his death won't be in vain," Abigail promised. "We're going to use this to bring Wilkes to justice." When Abigail emerged from the minister's house an hour later, clutching a wrapped bundle to her chest, Colton was at her side in an instant. "You got it?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, unable to suppress the smile of triumph. "Everything we need." Their success was short-lived. As they turned toward the boarding house, Abigail's gaze caught on a familiar face across the street. Deputy Miller, Sheriff Wilkes's right-hand man. "Colton," she whispered urgently. "We've been found." Without breaking stride, Colton casually draped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as if they were merely sweethearts out for a stroll. "Don't look back. Keep walking naturally." "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter now. We need to get back to the boarding house, grab our things, and go." They maintained their leisurely pace until they were out of the deputy's direct line of sight, then quickened their steps toward the boarding house. Inside their room, Colton moved with controlled urgency, gathering their belongings while Abigail secured the precious documents in an inside pocket of her coat. "Ready?" Colton asked, hand on the doorknob. Abigail nodded, her heart pounding. "Ready." They descended the stairs as casually as possible, but when they reached the bottom, Mrs. Finley stepped out from behind the front desk with a thunderous expression. "You lied to me," she accused, pointing a finger at Abigail. "This ain't your brother." Before either could respond, the front door burst open, and Deputy Miller entered with two unfamiliar men, clearly hired guns based on their rough appearance and the way they immediately reached for their weapons. "Abigail Harlow," Miller announced with a cold smile. "You're wanted for murder." In one fluid motion, Colton drew his revolver and fired, not at the men but at the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. The lamp shattered, spilling burning oil that immediately caught the entryway curtains aflame. In the ensuing chaos, he grabbed Abigail's hand and pulled her toward the back of the building. They burst through the kitchen door into the alley behind the boarding house, running full tilt toward the stables where they had left Colton's horse. Shouts and gunfire erupted behind them, a bullet splintering the wood of a water trough as they passed. Colton's horse was thankfully still saddled, as if he had anticipated the need for a quick escape. He boosted Abigail up and mounted behind her, spurring the animal into a gallop before they had even cleared the stable doors. "They'll follow," Abigail gasped as they thundered down Aurora's Main Street, townspeople diving out of their way. "I'm counting on it," Colton replied grimly. "We need to split them up." Instead of heading directly out of town, he guided the horse through a series of side streets, doubling back and creating a confusing trail before finally heading west into the foothills. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Aurora, but both knew the pursuit would continue. They made camp in a dense thicket, not daring to light a fire. The night air carried a bitter chill, and they huddled close for warmth beneath Colton's heavy coat. "What now?" Abigail asked, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves in the wind. "We need to get these documents to someone with authority, someone who can't be bought," Colton said. "There's a federal judge in Denver who I trust." "Denver is at least a 4-day ride, and that's assuming we're not being chased." "Which we are." Colton's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We'll have to be smarter, not faster." In the dim moonlight filtering through the branches above, Abigail could just make out the strong lines of his profile. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For believing me, for helping me, for not leaving me to face this alone." Colton turned to look at her, their faces inches apart. "You're risking your life to see justice done. How could I do any less?" The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Slowly, inevitably, Colton lowered his head until his lips brushed against hers, a kiss so gentle it might have been imagined. When he began to pull away, Abigail's hand rose to cup his cheek, drawing him back for a deeper kiss that left them both breathless. "I shouldn't have done that," Colton murmured, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "Why not?" Abigail challenged. "Because when this is over, you'll have choices again. A future you might not want." "Don't tell me what I might want," she interrupted. "I know my own heart," Colton Kane. He searched her face in the darkness, as if looking for doubt or confusion. Finding none, he pulled her closer, his kiss more confident this time, conveying everything he couldn't yet put into words. The journey to Denver became a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Wilkes's men were clearly under orders to find them at any cost, forcing Colton and Abigail to travel by night and hide during daylight hours. They avoided roads and settlements, navigating instead through wilderness that tested even Colton's considerable skills. During one particularly harrowing day, they took shelter in an abandoned mine shaft when a search party passed within yards of their location. Pressed together in the darkness, they scarcely dared to breathe until the sounds of horses and men faded into the distance. "That was too close," Abigail whispered, her body trembling with a combination of fear and cold. Colton's arms encircled her, his warmth a shield against both. "They're growing desperate. Wilkes must know we have the evidence." "How much farther to Denver?" 2 days, maybe 3 in these conditions. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, their connection deepened with each passing day. In stolen moments of safety, they shared stories of their pasts and dreams for a future that seemed increasingly possible, if only they could survive long enough to claim it. On the 7th day of their journey, with Denver's outskirts finally visible in the distance, disaster struck. A sudden gunshot from a ridge above sent them diving for cover behind a fallen log. 3 riders had spotted them and were closing in fast. "Run for those rocks," Colton ordered, drawing his revolver. "I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," Abigail insisted, pulling out her own gun. "Abigail, the documents are what matter. You need to get them to Judge Hollister." Another bullet splintered the wood near Abigail's head. Colton returned fire, forcing the approaching riders to seek cover. "Go," he urged. "I'll be right behind you." Recognizing the logic if not liking it, Abigail clutched the precious bundle inside her coat and sprinted for the rocky outcropping 30 yards away. The sound of gunfire intensified behind her, but she didn't look back until she reached the relative safety of the boulders. Colton was engaged in a fierce exchange with 2 of the men, while the third was attempting to circle around toward Abigail's position. Without hesitation, she took careful aim and fired, just as Colton had taught her. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder, and tumbled from his horse. The distraction gave Colton the opportunity to dispatch one of his opponents, but as he turned toward the remaining gunman, his foot slipped on loose gravel. The momentary loss of balance was all his adversary needed. A shot rang out and Colton crumpled to the ground. "No!" Abigail screamed, firing wildly at the remaining attacker. Her shots went wide, but they were enough to make the man retreat temporarily. Heart pounding, she ran to Colton's side. Blood soaked through his shirt at the shoulder, but his eyes were open and alert. "Not as bad as it looks," he grimaced, allowing her to help him to his feet. "But we need to move before he brings friends." Supporting much of his weight, Abigail helped Colton to where his horse waited, miraculously unharmed. With considerable effort, they both mounted, Colton's arms encircling her waist as she took the reins. "Denver," he said through gritted teeth. "We're so close." Abigail spurred the horse forward, every sense alert for pursuit as they made their way toward the city. By the time they reached the outskirts, Colton's grip had weakened, his head occasionally dropping to rest against her back as consciousness threatened to leave him. "Stay with me," she urged. "Just a little further." Finding Judge Hollister's residence required asking directions several times, each interaction filling Abigail with dread that they would be recognized. Finally, they arrived at an imposing house on a quiet street lined with elm trees. Colton was barely conscious as Abigail helped him from the horse. Together, They staggered to the front door, where Abigail pounded desperately. The door opened to reveal a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes. "Judge Hollister?" Abigail asked. "I am he," the man confirmed, his gaze shifting to Colton's bloodied form. "Good Lord, what's happened here? My name is Abigail Harlow. This is Colton Kane of the Territorial Marshal's office. We have evidence of corruption and murder against Sheriff Wilkes of Silver Creek, but his men are hunting us. Please, he needs a doctor." The judge hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. "Bring him in. Martha," he called to someone within the house. "Send for Dr. Williams immediately." What followed was a blur of activity. Colton was taken to a guest bedroom where the doctor, upon arrival, extracted the bullet from his shoulder and pronounced him lucky the wound was painful but had missed any vital areas. While Colton rested, Abigail presented the documents to Judge Hollister in his study. The judge spent hours reviewing them, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is the most comprehensive evidence of corruption I've seen in 20 years on the bench," he finally said, setting down the last of the papers. "You've taken an extraordinary risk bringing this to light, Miss Harlow." "It was Mr. Davidson who took the greatest risk," Abigail replied. "He paid with his life, and you were wrongfully accused of his murder." The judge made a note on a sheet of paper. "I'll send telegrams tonight. By morning, federal marshals will be on their way to Silver Creek to arrest Wilkes and his accomplices. Will they believe the evidence? Wilkes is powerful in that county. This evidence, combined with your testimony and that of Mr. Kane, will be more than sufficient." The judge offered a reassuring smile. "You're safe now, Miss Harlow, both of you are." True to his word, Judge Hollister arranged for a contingent of federal marshals to depart for Silver Creek the following day. Abigail and Colton remained under his protection, recovering from their ordeal and preparing for the trial that would surely follow. Colton's recovery was slower than he would have liked, his natural restlessness making him a difficult patient. Abigail spent hours at his bedside, reading to him from the judge's extensive library or simply talking, their connection deepening into something neither could deny. One afternoon, when Colton was finally strong enough to sit in the garden behind the judge's home, they spoke of the future for the first time since their desperate flight. "What will you do when this is over?" Colton asked, watching a butterfly flit between late summer flowers. Abigail considered the question. "I hadn't thought beyond survival until now. I suppose I could find work in Denver, perhaps in another millinery shop." "Is that what you want?" She met his gaze directly. "What I want is to never again feel as helpless as I did that night in Silver Creek." "Beyond that?" She hesitated, then continued with newfound boldness. "Beyond that, I want to be with you, wherever that might lead." Colton reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been thinking. My family's ranch in Texas, it's been sitting empty since my parents died. I've always meant to go back someday." "Is someday now?" Abigail asked softly. "It could be. It's good land, plenty of room to build a life. But it would be a hard start, and I wouldn't ask you to." Abigail silenced him with a kiss. "Ask me." 2 weeks later, news arrived that Sheriff Wilkes and 6 of his men had been arrested without bloodshed. Alina Jenkins had come forward as a witness, corroborating Abigail's account and adding details about her brother's investigation that strengthened the case further. The trial was held in Denver, far from Wilkes's sphere of influence. Abigail testified calmly and clearly, her eyes never wavering from the former sheriff's face as she recounted what she had seen that night. Colton's testimony regarding his long investigation into the corruption added weight to the prosecution's case. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, Abigail felt a burden lift from her shoulders that she had carried for months. Outside the courthouse, standing in the autumn sunshine, she turned to Colton with tears of relief in her eyes. "It's really over," she breathed. He nodded, drawing her close. "Justice for Davidson and freedom for us." Judge Hollister approached them as they stood together, offering his hand first to Colton, then to Abigail. "The territory owes you both a debt of gratitude," he said. "What will you do now?" Colton glanced at Abigail, who nodded with a smile. "We're heading to Texas, Your Honor. Got a ranch that needs rebuilding and a life that needs starting." The judge smiled. "I've taken the liberty of arranging some compensation for your troubles. It's not much, but it might help with that fresh start." He handed Colton an envelope containing a sum that, while modest by some standards, represented more money than either of them had seen in years. "Consider it a wedding present," the judge added with a knowing glance between them, "assuming that's in your plans." Colton's ears reddened, but Abigail laughed. "It is indeed, Your Honor. Thank you." They were married 3 days later in Judge Hollister's study, with the judge himself officiating and his wife Martha serving as witness. Abigail wore a simple cream-colored dress purchased for the occasion, and Colton looked uncommonly handsome in a new black suit that made his blue eyes even more striking. The journey to Texas was far more leisurely than their desperate flight to Denver had been. They traveled by train for much of the distance, Colton's arm protectively around Abigail as she marveled at landscapes she had never seen before. The Kane Ranch was exactly as Colton had described it, 500 acres of good grazing land, with a modest but solid house nestled in a grove of oak trees. The buildings showed signs of neglect after years of standing empty, but the bones were strong. "It needs work," Colton acknowledged as they stood on the porch that first evening, watching the sun set over what was now their land. Abigail leaned into his embrace, her heart full. "So do most things worth having." The first year was indeed challenging. They worked from sunrise to sunset repairing fences, mending the roof, acquiring livestock, and planting a vegetable garden that would help see them through the winter. The nearest town was 15 miles away, making every trip for supplies an all-day affair. But there were joys that balanced the hardships. The satisfaction of seeing the ranch come back to life under their care, the discovery of shared laughter over meals prepared together, the peaceful rhythm of days unmarked by fear or pursuit. And most of all, the deepening of their love in ways that neither had imagined possible when fate first threw them together. When spring arrived, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the fields in brilliant color, Abigail shared news that brought tears of joy to Colton's eyes. They would be welcoming a child before the year was out. Their son, James William Kane, was born as the first snows of winter dusted the ranch. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, evident even in his earliest days. As Abigail nursed him before the fireplace on Christmas Eve, Colton sat beside them, one arm around his wife, one finger clasped in his son's tiny hand. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "A family, a home that's more than just a place to sleep." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder. "When I ran from Silver Creek that night, I thought my life was ending. I couldn't have imagined it was just beginning." Over the years that followed, the Kane Ranch prospered. They added a second story to the house as their family grew to include a daughter, Eleanor Martha, born 2 years after James. Colton's reputation for fair dealing and fine horses spread throughout the county, while Abigail discovered an unexpected talent for breeding and training the intelligent cattle dogs essential to ranch operations. They never forgot the danger and fear that had brought them together, but those memories faded to the background, overwhelmed by the joys of their shared life. Occasionally, news would reach them from Colorado Judge Hollister sending word of his retirement, or a newspaper article noting that the town of Silver Creek had elected an honest woman as its new mayor. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Colton surprised Abigail with a special gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children. As he fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingered on the soft skin at her nape, still sending shivers down her spine after all these years. "Happy?" he asked, a question he already knew the answer to but loved to hear nonetheless. Abigail turned in his arms, her face upturned to his. The young woman who had once fled for her life had grown into a confident, capable ranch wife whose strength matched his own. "More than happy," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Grateful for every moment since that night you found me in the rain." "Best thing I ever did," Colton murmured against her lips, "was not put out that campfire 10 minutes earlier. Might have missed you entirely." Abigail laughed, the sound still his favorite in the world. "I would have found you anyway. Some things are meant to be." As twilight settled over the ranch, their children's voices called them to dinner, a reminder of the beautiful, ordinary life they had built from the ashes of danger and desperation. Hand in hand, they walked toward their home, toward the future they had fought so hard to claim. The truth that had once threatened to destroy them had ultimately set them free, giving them not just justice, but the greatest gift of all, a love that had begun in darkness but would flourish in the light for all their days to come.